Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Walt Bauer, and I'm the Pre-Service Training Coordinator at the Human Development Institute at the University of Kentucky. Welcome to the Human Development Institute's second fall seminar in the HDI seminar series. My pronouns are he, him, his. My brief visual description is I'm a white male wearing glasses with hazel eyes and a blue collared shirt with a blue, white, and gray tie. My virtual background is a 3-story brick building that has offices for the Human Development Institute on the University of Kentucky campus. We use Zoom for our virtual platform. Our speakers will provide an opportunity for questions today. We welcome questions from all of our participants. Please type your questions for our speakers in the Q&A box for a robust question and answer session. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is a Q&A option. Please use the chat box for technical questions. We have real-time captioning for the webinar in the closed captioning feature. Turn on the captioning by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen and then clicking Show Subtitle. Should you have questions about CEUs, you can contact me. My email address is walt.bauer@uky.edu. Again, my email address is walt.bauer@uky.edu. Please take a moment to complete our brief evaluation. You will receive an email that provides a link to access the session evaluation after the webinar. It is really helpful as we plan for upcoming webinars. The title of this webinar is Opportunities for Disabled Researchers and Scholars. Our panelists today are Dr. Lynn Cook, Professor Emeritus, Department of Rehabilitation, Human Resources and Communication Disorders, Counselor Education Program, the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. We also have on our panel today, Austin Nugent, a Disability Program Administrator at the Human Development Institute at the University of Kentucky. We also have as a panelist today, Dr. James Krause, Distinguished University Professor at the Medical University of South Carolina and Associate Dean for Research in the Medical University of South Carolina's College of Health Professions. We also have Dr. Philip Rumrell as a panelist. Dr. Rumrell is the Director of Research at the Human Development Institute at the University of Kentucky. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Cook.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me on this panel. In terms of my description, I am, I guess, middle-aged, approaching old age. I've got light brown hair, about shoulder length. I'm wearing glasses, and I am sitting in my living room with decorations as my background. I'm sitting in a blue reclining chair. My preferred gender pronouns are she, her, and hers. Because this is a panelist of people with disabilities, I want to share that my disabilities are psychiatric, and I also live with chronic pain. Did I cover it all?
You got it, Dr. Cook. Dr. Cook, would you like to start with the slides?
Did you want to introduce the other panelists, or?
We could briefly introduce the other panelists. Austin, would you like to briefly introduce yourself, please?
Hi, my name is Austin Nugent. I am a woman in my early 30s with brown hair pulled back in a bun. I'm also wearing a multicolored turtleneck blouse. Behind me is my green office with various colors of bright art on the wall and a yellow chair. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am, like I said, a disability program administrator with the Human Development Institute, and I have my master's of public administration. So I kind of stumbled into research. Sometimes I forget that I am a researcher because I often am thinking about programs and policies and systems, but I very much feel, Dr. Rumrow reminds me often that I am a researcher, but in addition to my role at HGI, where I work on various projects related to systems change, specifically targeting health issues for people with disabilities, I serve on the National Disability Rights Network Board of Directors, as well as our state disability rights agency, so the Kentucky Protection and Advocacy Agency's council, advisory council for individuals with mental health conditions, and the Center for Accessible Living, which is our statewide Center for Independent Living Board of Directors, as the advocacy chair. And my personal experience with disabilities, I'm an individual who experiences obsessive compulsive disorder and chronic migraines, as well as having 3 younger brothers who have various support needs and disabilities. My biological brother has Down syndrome, and then I have 2 adopted brothers that, due to some pretty adverse childhood experiences, have their own support needs that my family is continuing to learn about. And I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you, Austin. Dr. Rumroll, would you like to briefly introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me on this august panel. I know Dr. Kraus will be joining us a little later, right? He has another meeting, Walt, that backs up to this one.
Absolutely. He'll be joining us soon.
Yes. Folks, I'm phoning in today as an accessibility matter. I look better on the phone than I do on video, that's for sure. I'm a 56-year-old white male. My pronouns are he, his, and him. I used to be balding, and now I'm bald. Walt, you can empathize with me, I believe. And I have hazel-colored eyes. I'm wearing a red golf-style shirt with a collar. And Dr. Cook, in honor of the University of Arkansas, I'm wearing my Razorbacks shirt today. I sitting in a nondescript office with an unremarkable background. Glad to be with you all. Dr. Bauer mentioned I'm the Director of Research at HDI, and so I work across a number of projects. My faculty appointment is in counselor education at UK. I am a member of the disability community as well. I happen to be blind. And I use person-first language to describe my own experience with disability, but we recognize and honor the fact that some people prefer identity-first language, and we support everyone's prerogative to express and identify themselves exactly as they wish to. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Rumroll. Looks like we have a raised hand. You're welcome to share if you'd like to. Or feel free to put your comment in the chat. Dr. Cook, we'll turn it over to you.
We wanted to open this panelist discussion just with an overview of what participatory action research is, and then get into, as quickly as we can, individuals on the panel and their responses to a set of questions that Walt put together for us. So could you change it to the next slide, please? First, I wanted to define what participatory action research is. And I ask my other panelists, please jump in at any time if there's something you want to add or something that I've missed. And I might call out on you to do that as well. But participatory action research is defined as applied research that emphasizes that the research participants are leaders in the research process And they are also co-researchers, and they directly participate in all phases of the research process. That's from identifying and defining the problem, developing the research design, analyzing the results, solving the problem, and disseminating the research results in terms of being co-authors on publication, or also being co-presenters if the research is being presented to different audiences. So I think the key is that the research participants are co-researchers. We may think in terms of traditional research that your participants are more subjects or objects of the research, and their role is pretty passive, other than, for example, answering survey questions, or other things like that. Anything anyone would like to add to the definition? Okay, let's go to the next.
No, Lynn, I just,
Go
I
ahead.
just while you're transitioning the slide, I was just thinking that part about people with disabilities being involved in all aspects of the research,
Yes.
it's not uncommon to, conduct a study with a particular population. Then after the study's over, ask the group, hey, what'd you think about these findings? And that's, that's better than not asking them at all. But really, from the very initial phases of the research in PAR philosophy and practice, that disabled researchers are involved from the very, very beginning. So in that way, this really becomes a study that really is by and with the disability community, and everything just works more authentically that way. We have a better chance of asking the right questions. We have a better chance of identifying the right methods when people, whoever the group is that we're studying is involved in every way along the way. So that word "all," I think, Lynn, makes a big difference.
And this is Austin. I'll add, I think so often when we talk about individuals with disabilities, this idea of decision making comes up. And I think that's a key thing about that participatory action research, is that the individuals with disabilities are part of the decision making process, which is critical to making sure we're getting research projects right.
That's a really good
Absolutely.
point that you've made, and that you've made also, Phil. I do want to add one thing that's not happening, or it's happening in some cases, but it needs to happen more, is that I believe that, and others have written about how the research participants as co-researchers should be paid for the work that they're doing if it's truly going to be participatory action research. And this is through funding agencies. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But next slide, please. Again, professional researchers are also active participants, and they collaborate with the participant researchers. But their role is a little bit different than in traditional research, where they might be viewed as the experts. And in participatory action research, their role is more, again, to be active participants along with the participant researchers. They're also learners because their main goal is to learn from the participants about their experiences with whatever the phenomenon is that's being studied. They also share their expertise with the participants in terms of research design, and they can facilitate the whole process of participatory action research, because the participants, this may be the first time they've ever been researchers. And so the role of the researcher is equivalent to the role of the participants because they both have expertise to share. The ultimate goal of participatory action research is not simply to gain knowledge, but rather to implement actions, and that's the action part of PAR, that are directed at solving the research problem. And so these actions in many cases, well, never mind. I'll give you some examples of actions when we talk about different approaches that are used in participatory action research. But again, do any of my colleagues on the panel want to add anything to this?
This is Austin. I often, when I work with health professionals, this concept of subject matter experts so often comes up, and I think sometimes people think that it's just like, I'm an expert in this subject as it relates to maybe cancer or tobacco cessation. But I also like to point out that a subject is that lived experience that one can bring to the table, whether it's about disability or race or your gender. So I think that's a key thing, is like remembering that people with disabilities are in fact subject matter experts on disability, and they have such crucial information to provide researchers to help improve their research design and in the implementation and dissemination.
Absolutely. All right, next slide. So I looked through all kinds of literature, and there are many principles, and they differ across the literature of participatory action research. I would also characterize these as characteristics of participatory action research. Again, the first and most important characteristic is the direct involvement of the research participants, and how it results, as Austin just mentioned, in a more accurate and authentic analysis of their experiences with the problem under study and how to solve it, because they truly are the experts in the case of disability on what it's like to be a person with disabilities. The problem originates in the community and is solved by the community. And that community may be, for example, if you're doing research on the experiences of students with disabilities at a university, it may be the university. The community may be a work setting. It may be a community of individuals who live in a certain neighborhood or a certain part of town. So the definition of community can vary. The goals of PAR are radical transformation of social reality and the resolution of social injustices. So whatever we can do to contribute to that through our research is really important. We may not always achieve that radical transformation, but we always aim to do that. And in some cases, just doing this research and having other individuals who feel isolated and very alone in their experiences, and then they realize that there are other people out there like them who share these experiences, that can be very, very transformative just for that individual. Anything else to add?
Well, this is Phil. I appreciate that point, Lynn, that it really isn't just about the findings of the research that, provides the benefit for, the group that is under study or that, that is participating. It can be the process itself. And so the very fact of getting involved in a focus group, right, about the employment concerns of people with multiple sclerosis, or being asked to help frame research questions regarding the educational experience of autistic children from the point of view of the children themselves or their parents. The process of being involved in that can be of benefit to participants. And we hope that folks will benefit from whatever the new knowledge is gained or the new actions that are undertaken. But just by being involved and being able to exercise autonomy and choice and self-determination, I know we're going to get to those very important principles as well. But there's opportunity for growth throughout the entire process. We're not just taking information from people and then figuring it out. People themselves are involved in everything having to do, and this is back to the old disability rights movement and the rallying cry of the disability advocacy movement, the disability pride movement, and that's nothing about us without us. We're going to be studying the concerns of people with disabilities and need to be involved in that. And we're there making some great traction in finding ways that people with disabilities, and by doing this, the disability community then sets not only the research agenda, but possibly the social policy agenda that results from those findings, or the policy agenda that is reflected in those findings. So there's the research is better when people are involved, but by people's very involvement, they are making changes with regard to important problems and concerns in their lives. And if the words radical transformation and improvements and things like that, if those don't resonate with you right now, given all of the health and economic disparities that attend to the disability experience in 2024, I would humbly suggest we're not paying enough attention, because we still have a long way to go in achieving the kind of equality and full participation that people with disabilities tell us all the time that's what they want. We're not quite there yet. And so as encouraging as it gets, and we'll continue to do that, we have to really stay vigilant to make sure that we are attending to these ongoing and lingering and seemingly intractable problems that really do persist. And maybe one study at a time doesn't move the needle too far, but it points us in the right direction. And this model, PAR, engages people in solving the problems that and addressing the issues that are most important to them. So you really see the value kind of across various purposes of what applied research ought to be.
And this is Austin. I'll add, back to what Dr. Rummel said about like the impact on the disabled individuals. It's also the impact on the non-disabled researchers and the lessons they've learned, that they are going to then take that new knowledge and new information about how to design a more inclusive research project and carry that with them, hopefully throughout the future. And so I think that's also a really important lesson or outcome of participatory action research, and just thinking about sustainability of, we've now got more allies.
Thank you again. Those are excellent points that you've both contributed. Next slide, please. Some other principles are that the participant researchers, and Austin and Phil both already kind of spoke to this, but they gain an increased awareness of their strengths and capabilities and how to mobilize these into action through the process. And so just participating in research, is very, very empowering. And it also, as Austin stated, it demonstrates to researchers without disabilities that the participants with disabilities can really contribute to designing and implementing and evaluating important actions through research in collaboration with the professionally trained researchers. One thing to consider too is that you really have to build trust if you're going to do participatory action research, because in so many instances, individuals with disabilities have been involved in research studies where the researcher comes in, does the study, exits, or they may never even meet the researcher. Some of the research that has been done has portrayed people with disabilities as being very impaired and incapable of contributing to society because they have a disability. And so there can be a lot of distrust of researchers based on prior experiences. A lot of the research may be pathological and portray them as being, again, just a burden to society and incapable of doing almost anything. Just to give you kind of example of this wasn't a research study, but I went to see my rheumatologist, and he was asking me all these questions about my chronic pain. They were all very pathology-oriented questions. Then when he was done, he shocked me and he said, "Wow, you have no quality of life." And I was just really taken aback. I did not know how to respond because I actually have a great quality of life. But because he was only asking these pathologizing questions, it seemed that my life was just filled with misery and the incapacity to participate in activities outside my home. And I think that's what a lot of research can do if it's pathology oriented. And participatory action research, on the contrary, focuses on everything that people with disabilities have to contribute to society and to the research process, and not what all their pathologies are. I mentioned this before, but one thing we really need to think about, and when we're writing grants for funding through these big agencies, we should include them financial support for PAR that's actually can be very expensive because it can be very lengthy research. As I said, it takes time to gain entry and trust. And just the whole process of going through identifying what the problems are, to, how we're going to solve these problems. That in and of itself, the preliminary part of the research can be, very time consuming. I also believe, as do others, that if this is going to be truly, if we're going to meet the principles of PAR, that the participant researchers should be paid for the work that they're doing, just like the professional researchers are being paid. Any comments from my colleagues?
Dr. Cook, I have it on good authority that people with disabilities like to get paid for their work as much as non-disabled people, right?
Exactly, yes. And so we need to be paying them for being participant researchers and not just giving them, these small incentives, but actual pay.
I love it. Thank you.
Next slide, please. I just wanted to give you some example of PAR techniques. These are characteristics of participatory action research because they use techniques that you may not see in more traditional research. A big part of participatory action research is observations out in the field, what's going on in your community. And these observations help us determine what is going on that we need to address. Individual interviews are conducted by all the researchers. In some cases, you might have the professional researcher and the participant researcher co-conduct the interviews, or you train. This is the role of the researcher, is to train the participants in how to conduct research that's going to conduct or elicit a lot of important data and information from the participants. Another example is peer interviews, and that's where the participants, the researcher, the professional researcher is completely left out of the process, except maybe to be an advisor and, like I said, to train the participants in interviewing. But they end up interviewing each other. And the idea is that you get more honest, authentic data when you are interviewing someone who has intimate experience with the phenomenon that's being explored, and you also have that experience. And so your data are what they call, the term they use in qualitative research, which is most of what I do, is your data is richer. It's thicker. There was a study, for example, where they did this with women who lived in poverty and were single mothers. And I don't remember what the specific research question was, but what the researchers did is very different than what you see in traditional research. First of all, they cooked a dinner for all the participants. And they all met and they had dinner and talked about the research study. Then they trained these women to interview each other, and the interviewers stayed out of the picture completely. So that's, I think, a good example of peer interviews, and how it can really enrich the data that you collect. Another, probably many of you are familiar with focus groups. This started in marketing research, and then it moved more into research in the behavioral sciences. But focus groups are a form of interviewing where you bring together a group of, 6 to 12 individuals, and you ask them a research question, one of the research questions, and or I'm sorry, you ask them the questions from the interview protocol that you and the research team have developed. And again, that involves the participants who help develop the interview. And so the idea is that when you have focus groups, individuals listen to each other, and that helps them to build on each other's ideas. You don't have that advantage in individual interviews. You do somewhat have that advantage in peer interviews, but in focus groups, you have large groups, and someone might bring up an issue or a concern, and other participants will say, yes, that's been my experience too. And I think that's really important. And here's what my experience is. So that's the advantage of doing focus groups. Participatory needs assessment, oftentimes that's done when you go out initially into the community. And that's the first phase once you've gained entry and trust into that community. And so you have your co-researchers along with the researchers conduct a needs assessment to determine what needs, to happen, what action we need to implement to address the problem we're studying. And another really good example of that is there were some dietary researchers who wanted to address the issue in a community of a high rate of diabetes. And so they gained access into that community. And they talked with participants and they found out that, there were a lot of fats, a lot of lard was used in their food. And so they also talked about, well, how are we going to address this? And how are we going to really get people to become involved in this and make the necessary changes? Well, in the needs assessment, they determined that in the community, adults were like, well, I'm not really motivated to change my diet, but I want my kids to grow up healthy. And so in terms of how we make changes in our diet, what they did, rather than, the dietary researchers going in and saying, well, you need to eat these foods, and that food. Instead, they looked at all the recipes that are traditional foods that this community ate, and how they could maybe change some of the ingredients to make them more healthy. And it was really interesting because the research actually involved going into people's kitchens and working together to create recipes, and then to taste the recipes and say, no, this doesn't work, or yes, that ingredient substitution will work. And then developing like a cookbook. So that's a real good example of a PAR technique, I think, that involved the community members. So anything anyone would like to add regarding these techniques? Okay, next slide, please. Another technique is photo voice. Some of you may be familiar with this, and I don't know if you do this through your center. But this technique, I know Boston University Center for Psychiatric Disabilities had a big research project where they used photo voice. And photo voice is where individuals are given cameras, or they use their cell phones. They go out in the community, and in this case, the whole purpose was to reduce stigma against people with psychiatric disabilities. So they took photos of images that represented the impact of stigma on them. And then they would give the photo a title, and they would describe it. And then they would go out into the community, and they might have an art gallery exhibition. They would bring their projects to policymakers and politicians so they could see how stigma affects them. And one of the photos that sticks out in my mind was a picture of a Barbie doll in a trash can, and the Barbie doll was upside down in the trash can. And the title of the photo was "She Had So Much Potential." And this was the experience of a young woman who was diagnosed with a psychiatric disability. And that's how she was treated, that now all that potential you had is gone. And that photo just sticks out because it made me so angry, and it really made me want to reach out to that woman and say, no, that's not the case. You still have the same potential. Getting to where you want to get in your life, it may just look different than it did before you were diagnosed with your psychiatric condition. The performing arts too. these are examples of PAR techniques: poetry, music, dance, comedy. I was fortunate to what do you call it when you're an actor and you try out for a role, to audition for an organization called This Is My Brave, which some of you may be familiar with. And I wrote an essay on the experience of living with the conditions that I have, and how I moved from this place of just complete despair to having a really full, enriching life and being successful in my career, having great relationships and friends and, a nice house and all of that. There were individuals in there who read poetry. Some of them did what is kind of, it's not exactly slam poetry, but kind of a version of slam poetry. Music, dance, comedy, and how research is done then is there is a researcher who works with this organization, This Is My Brave, and she will do research such as, what was it like for you to participate as a performer in This Is My Brave? How did it feel? How was it, how did it increase your pride as a person with a disability? And then they would also do pre and post testing with the audience members in terms of their attitudes about psychiatric disability. But I can tell you, just participating in that was a frightening, getting up in front of a large audience and sharing your very intimate story about a very very stigmatized conditions, was frightening, but it was so, empowering to just be able to talk about what is a part of your life. It's not your whole life, but it is a part of your life. And to share how just because this is a part of my life does not mean I have a very rich and fulfilling life. Another example of a PAR technique is the concerns report methodology. And Phil, I'm going to turn that over to you because you've used this methodology to describe what it is.
Yes, thank you. This is just one of many, mechanisms for engaging the disability community actively in all phases of research. And this is a process that came out of the University of Kansas in the 1980s and has been widely used ever since. It's really about identifying a problem or issue or concern in the lives of people with disabilities and engaging people with disabilities and other people with an interest in ensuring that the community is as inclusive as possible in that process of addressing whatever the concern is. And we keep talking about the kind of problem focus and deficit reduction in research, and certainly there are a lot of problems that need to be solved. But one of the really interesting things about the concerns report method is that it applies really equal emphasis on identifying and preserving strengths in policies and practices affecting the disability community, as well as remedying or correcting weaknesses. Quite often, if we get too bogged down in the difficulties and challenges and obstacles that confront the disability community, we lose sight of the fact, as in the case of your rheumatologist, Lynn, that there's all kinds of things that may be working just fine, and why not bring those out and look for ways to accentuate them? And sometimes people find that to be a more encouraging approach. It's more balanced. It's not just focusing on the negative aspects, et cetera. So how the concerns report method usually works, and it's informed by individuals and groups of people with disabilities really at all stages along the way. The first thing we do is identify what the issue or concern might be. And we don't have to have a lot of depth on that. Just understanding that this is something in the community that people with that particular condition or representing that population care about. But we did a study a few years ago of the employment concerns of Americans with multiple sclerosis, and we applied the concerns report method in this study. So first, we had to look at is there a problem, and there's a significant problem. People with MS are employed at a rate of about 40%, as opposed to 77.3% in the non-disabled population. That's not good enough. And people with MS have a lot to contribute to the workforce, and they're currently not doing it. And those folks with MS who aren't working, most of them say they'd like to work. Most of them feel they could work. And so we need to find ways of moving the needle on labor force participation, so that and we'll stop when everyone with MS who wants to work has a good and meaningful job. So work's cut out for us there because of the disparity in employment rate. That's where it started. So we wanted to dig a little more deeply into this issue, and we needed to find out more about it beyond the employment rate. What are the issues? What are the concerns? So we engaged a working group of people with MS. This was in the state of Missouri. And we asked them to identify a potential item pool of all the possible employment concerns that could affect or that might be present for folks with MS. And we asked people to share from their own experiences, from their work with support groups. We looked at the National MS Society's policy statements and their websites. We looked at existing research on the subject, all done with this working group of 13 people with MS. We came up with an item pool of 157 possible employment concerns. We didn't mean to suggest that was an exhaustive list, but it's quite a considerable list. And then we had to, we wanted to find a way to figure out which of these concerns are most important to people with MS. So we convened several other groups of folks with MS and healthcare providers who work with people with MS and employers and vocational rehabilitation professionals. And we asked them all to nominate from these 157, which ones do you think are the most important? Are there ones here that duplicate each other, ones that maybe aren't quite so important, and which things you really would put at the top of the agenda? And so from that, there became a list, and there was quite a drop off after the 38 top employment concerns. 39 wasn't near, it was much less important. We had to cut it off somewhere because we wanted to have this happen in sort of manageable chunks. So they reduced the number of items to the highest priority ones from the point of view of all these people who have an interest in the employment of folks with MS. We developed then a national survey, circulated the survey to about 5,000 people with MS, 2,000 of whom responded. And we asked them to evaluate each of those 38 already important items on two dimensions. One, how important is it to you that people with MS have access to reasonably priced prescription medications, just for example, to support their health so they can continue working? So is it important to you that that is in fact the case? And are you satisfied that that is in fact the case? Okay. So then we took the ratings, yes, no on importance and yes, no on satisfaction. And the items that were rated as important by the majority of respondents, we looked at them in two dimensions. One, what was the satisfaction rating? So we decided arbitrarily to throw out all of the employment concerns that the majority of people didn't think were important. Well, guess what? All 38 items were viewed as important by at least 84% of the sample. So this really underscored the fact that this working group prioritized and funneled the items down, and the national survey, which was a much larger perspective, really ratified these as highly important items. So the high importance items where the majority said they were satisfied, we viewed those as strengths. the high priority items that people viewed as unsatisfactory by the majority of people, we viewed those as weaknesses. And there ended up being about 12 strengths and 26 weaknesses. We then took that entire agenda of the 38 items, put them into the two categories, and brought them to focus groups to address both the strengths and the weaknesses, starting with the top 10 strengths, and then to the top 10, the strongest strengths and the weakest weaknesses, if you will, and asked participants in these focus groups, and these were back to the same groups, not only folks with MS, family members of people with MS, vocational rehabilitation service providers, healthcare professionals who work with people with MS, and professionals who work in the National MS Society. And we asked them to make recommendations in the group that would either preserve those strengths or correct those weaknesses. And the recommendations could be anything that the group wanted. And we asked them to identify the strategy and then put some action verbs into it. What do we need to do to make this happen? What are the facilitators that would make it easiest to implement that recommendation? And what might be the barriers and obstacles that we need to take into account? So based on these 38 items that are rated as highly important, some they're satisfied with, survey respondents, some they weren't, we ended up with 165 specific recommendations with all kinds of detail, and then presented this back to the National Multiple Sclerosis Society and said, if you want an agenda to make changes in the employment situation for people with MS, well, here are 165 possibilities for your agenda. And we could talk about each one of these. If you like 10 of them or like 5 of them, we could engage constituents again in figuring out how to put those things into practice. But from this process of getting a group together, starting with the literature, working our way through, we continually this continued process of sort of expanding and contracting and narrowing and then broadening the focus, so that by the time we're done, we've got a whole action plan in place to address the problem of labor force participation for people with MS. And we really use the concerns report method kind of step by step in doing this particular process. And you can just see sort of the power in the group, a dynamic that happens there. But at every point along the way, people with MS were informing us and participating in various roles, whether that's from identifying what the issue is that we're going to study, developing the instrument itself, conducting the survey, then interpreting the results and building the plan of action, which is really the most important thing. But that had to have an evidentiary base to it in order for it to be meaningful. And as you might imagine, whether it applied to the problem or the concern, or the importance or satisfaction that they ascribe to it, or finally the recommendations they would make based on these numbers and the depth of their responses, people had an awful lot to say about this. And all we really did was provide the structure to make that happen. And the experts in this study were the people with MS themselves. They were the ones living with the employment situation for the population. So we needed to hear from them at every point along the way. And this was really quite an interesting study in many ways. And we got to the end, 165. There'd be no other way to get that kind of depth than to involve people in the way that we did. So we credit our colleagues at the University of Kansas for getting us started on this. And we've used it many times in other projects, but it's just one example. It's just a really powerful tool to get at this kind of engagement across phases of the process.
Thank you. You reminded me too of one thing that's not included in here, is that when we disseminate our research findings and participatory action research, it's not just in the academic journals. It's also disseminated to advocacy organizations, the National MS Society, and published on their websites or in their newsletters, so that it gets directly in the hands of people with the disabilities that are similar or the same as those of the participants. And so I think that's really important as well, that we get the research out, not just to other academics, but to people with disabilities. And I know Phil
Thank
has done a lot of that.
Yeah, this, Dr. Cook,
Great.
this is Austin. You make such a great point. So I consider myself an advocate at heart. I'm always thinking about policy, and I think that's such a crucial thing is the folks who are going to legislators, for example. So often when we're advocating or educating legislators on disability rights issues, legislators are like, show us the data. And
Mhm.
so often, like, we don't have data on people with disabilities because researchers aren't asking the right questions to get that information. And then the researchers who are asking the questions and exploring these issues, we need to make sure that that information is being disseminated broadly, but also in a way that is accessible and understandable for folks who don't have an academic background, who maybe numbers aren't their thing. And so thinking about, concepts such as universal design and in the ways that we disseminate information in a way that is going to be accessible to the widest audience possible. And thinking about all the various platforms we can use to make sure the information is getting out there and into the hands of the people who can then use it to make policy change or to educate professionals and train them and all of those things that we need to happen as a result of research.
Yes. Once again, you have
Great
very
point.
excellent points. Okay, also, PAR techniques use essays that individuals write about their experiences, journals, vignettes, life histories, timelines in terms of looking at how things have progressed or not progressed. And again, these examples can be used in combination with each other. Phil described the concerns report methodology, which uses, focus groups, individual surveys, both quantitative and qualitative approaches to analyzing the data. So it's not just quantitative or qualitative research or using just one of these techniques. Oftentimes they're used in combination. And again, it's the research team, the individuals with disabilities who are members of that team who decide on what techniques are going to be most effective at answering our question and helping us to implement actions for change.
It's a great point, Lynn. This is Bill. I'm also thinking about the I don't know if it's a technique or just an orientation, but the whole the critical incident analysis.
Oh yes.
You talk to people about the those 4 or 5 key things in their life when we're talking about whatever it is we might be doing. And Dr. Bauer, who's moderating today, we've been doing some studies on airline and airport accessibility for people with disabilities. And Walt, I'm thinking about the interviews that we did with wheelchair users.
Yes.
Regarding their experiences. And we didn't set this up, Lynn and Austin and Walt and everybody, as a critical incident study, but that's what people wanted to talk about. So when you say, what are your experiences with airline accessibility, what kind of, and what they do is, just invariably, they go right to the story. It's, so before they even say it's good, it's bad, I don't do it, I do, I have problems with it, or I don't have any difficulties, it works great. They talk about the one time that, they talk about the time when their power wheelchair got broken in the belly of the plane and the airline did or didn't, fix it. They talk about when they are lining up to get on the plane and pre-boarding, so that the ground crew and the folks at the airline refer to them not as people, not as passengers, but as wheelchairs, right? They refer to them by their wheelchair, not by their humanity. and how depersonalizing that can be. They talk about what it's like to have to go through the scan, you know, as you go through security. But you have to listen to those stories and those sort of key flashpoint incidents, or they'll also tell stories, and Walt, they did in our study, about things that worked well for them and ways they would advocate for themselves, and registering in advance and making sure that they don't, that whoever's working with them, perhaps to, you know, assist them on the plane, is transferring them and transporting them in the right way. And when Dr. Kraus joins this call, I think he'll have some things to share. He would have things to share about this as well. But it really is that collection of those incidents that become really memorable. When we do research in career development, you know, we find that there's usually 3 to 5 kind of major crossroads, or things that happened that if they hadn't happened in that way, things would be totally different. Or 2 or 3 people you encounter at key points in your life that move you in that sort of you know, direction. And without those things happening, the whole path would be different. So understanding those flashpoint crossroads kinds of experiences where things went the way they went because of those things in particular, it's really a fascinating way to learn about any kind of phenomenon, and it's a great way to get people to open up with various kinds of stories. So I didn't want to belabor it, Lynn. It's just, this is really it's a fun and really enlightening you know, way of bringing information out of you. What are the 3 most important things that happen to you throughout your education, or in your healthcare journey, or as you were dealing with COVID and long COVID or something, you know, whatever that might be? What are those things that stick out? Because we tend to communicate in stories and incidents. You know, you're meeting with the rheumatologist, Lynn, you know, and you've had many other very positive experiences with folks related to your pain management and your healthcare. And those are the things that kind of, you know, we string together, but it's how people, it is how people communicate. It's not necessarily how we collect data.
Dr. Kleinert has a raised hand. Dr. Kleinert?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Dr.
Yes, sir.
Kleinert.
How you doing, Dr. Kleinert?
I'm fine. I have a question. First of all, I'm very impressed with this presentation. It just really excites me in terms of things I can still do in research at my age. But I don't know if you're going to be addressing barriers to participatory research, but one of the potential ones, or at least ones I actually have found, has been with IRBs, or institutional review boards. And obviously, IRBs have the obligation to protect human subjects. And people with disabilities are considered a vulnerable class. And persons with the most severe disabilities may be judged as not even being able to give consent. They may have a guardian or whatever, so therefore they cannot give consent to participate in research, which to me is a real problem in terms of these persons participating in participatory action research. So I just wanted to get the reaction of this panel in terms of at least what I perceive as a potential barrier, and how that may be addressed, especially for persons with the most severe disabilities. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Oh, Lynn, please. What a great question, huh? I mean,
Yeah. Briefly say to you that our IRB coordinator is getting more and more examples of, you know, new approaches to research, and particularly in the qualitative research realm. And she's been great because she communicates with the researchers, and we educate her, and then she goes and educates the IRB committee. So yes, sometimes the process takes longer, but in our case, at least she's open to learning about these techniques and how we are protecting, you know, human rights, and that you know, this research is unlikely to cause harm to participants. So I think it's really a matter of educating your IRB coordinator, who can then go back and educate the IRB committee.
This is Austin.
Austin,
Yeah,
No.
I figured you were gonna.
no, I want,
Oh,
I wanted to save the best for last, but you go ahead, Austin. You're you're in the middle of this, up to your elbows,
yeah,
aren't you?
yeah. I think it's over my head now.
No,
But
you're not. You're not.
So this is actually something I am working on creating a resource for through a Fund for Excellence through the Human Development Institute, and it's creating a resource guide on how do we how can researchers use concepts and frameworks such as universal design and other best practices for inclusion to be inclusive of people with disabilities in their research. And one of the key things that comes up is that informed consent process. And how do you make sure that people with disabilities are able to participate when there's all these barriers around in the informed consent process? So I'm working with some wonderful colleagues who have had great success in developing inclusive research designs and navigating those barriers with informed consent. But Dr. Cook makes such a great point. It is, a lot of it is educating, and it's educating IRB, but it's also, this is why participatory action research is so valuable, because so often I hear from other non-disabled researchers, well, IRB is telling me this, and so I'm just going to omit people with disabilities as participants because I don't want to open that can of worms. But when you have disabled individuals as part of the research team, they can be like, whoa, that's not the solution. The solution is we need to navigate this. Yes, it may take more time, but it's critical that we not omit people with disabilities from the research, because that's why this huge gap in data exists, because so often people hear, well, this is a vulnerable population, or well, what if they have a guardian? And so this is like going back to the value of participatory action research and the need to have disabled voices at the table helping guide the way, so that we can, pull on our lived experiences to emphasize the importance of this and problem solve. But yes, I'm currently working on developing a research guide that will hopefully be of use to researchers as they navigate the very issue of informed consent, and how do we make sure that we're empowering people with disabilities, including individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, to participate in research and be meaningfully engaged in research, while also recognizing that we need to follow policies and safety protocols to ensure, that we're implementing ethical, safe, responsible research projects. And Dr. Romo, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Can I ask one
Well,
more quick
well,
question?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yes, please.
How will we be able to access this resource guide? This sounds like a just tremendous resource.
It's still very much in the I'm in the content polling stages right now, but my goal, my hope is that HDI leadership will approve for it to be disseminated through HDI's channels. And I may end up pulling you in, Harold, to help kind of maybe share from your expertise, or maybe review the guide before it's finalized. Because I know you have a wealth of knowledge and wisdom and experience on making sure that people with disabilities are meaningfully included in research.
Thank you.
What, Dr. Kleiner, your question brings to mind this sort of what I see, and Austin, we've talked about this, and Lynn, I think you'd resonate with this too. There is a paradox in the way we structure informed consent, and the understandable need to protect vulnerable people from abuse and exploitation in research on one hand. On the other, we're seeking to empower and engage people with disabilities. We're viewing them as experts in the issues that affect them the most. And in that regard, in the way that we want to engage with these experts, it's hard to make the point that they're more vulnerable than anybody else. And so you see on both ends of the continuum, on one hand, we're wanting, if your study involves people with disabilities, it requires an extra level of protection and oversight to make sure that this vulnerable population is not exploited or taken advantage of. On the other hand, we have the disability pride movement, the disability rights and independent living movements that preceded it and led to it, many of whose leaders would reject out of hand the idea that just because you have a disability means that you're more vulnerable than anyone else. I would hate to suggest to Austin, she shared her disability status, that makes her more vulnerable as a participant in a research study. I know I wouldn't suggest this to Dr. Cook. When Dr. Kraus comes on and joins us, we don't want to tell him he's more vulnerable because of his spinal cord injury. He probably wouldn't accept that. So it's really interesting how we get at these issues, and yet at the same time, Dr. Kleiner, there are people we do have to make sure that they're offering their consent, or that they can form consent, and when they're not able to, how do we work within that? But I really see the fact that this is really out on the table. What makes a person more vulnerable than another person? Is it a diagnostic label? Is it their functional capabilities? Is it the opportunities they may or may not have? But there is an inherent assumption in our current human subjects and IRB protection rules. I'm not talking about UK only. I'm talking about universities and hospitals and other entities all over the country that really does, it begs this question, you know, if you're doing a study and it involves people with disabilities, it can't, for example, have an exempt or sometimes can't have an expedited review. At the same time, we would not necessarily embrace the notion that all people with disabilities are necessarily more vulnerable than people who aren't. And we got to sort that out too. And Austin, I know you're wrestling with this a little bit, but that assumption of vulnerability can be certainly a barrier to the kind of engagement that we're talking about. So as always, Dr. Kleiner, your questions make us think in ways we weren't before. Thank you.
This is Austin. I'll just follow up with, you know, Dr. Romo makes such a good point about this fine line between, you know, disability pride, but also wanting that need to protect based on the policies that are in place for research. And one of the methods I like to use, and I encourage others who, depending on their research design, is to use like pre-screener questions where you kind of ask like 4 or 5 questions based on the information that's in the cover letter, a cover letter that is universally designed with plain language and all of that to make sure the information is accessible. And then you have everybody who is interested in participating answer these screener questions. And sometimes we get the question back to us is like, well, why does everyone have to take this? Why did the non-disabled folks have to take this? And it's like, well, if we want to make sure that people are protected and understand what they're agreeing to do, don't we want that from everybody? Like, don't we want to make sure all people have a clear understanding of what they're agreeing to do? Not just disabled individuals, but folks who may not have a disability. And so I think it goes back, everything always is going to go back to what Dr. Cook first said, which is that education piece, educating folks, whether it's IRB, other researchers, to understand what we may already know because of our lived experience as disabled individuals and researchers.
And Dr. Cook, are you wishing like I am that I had these insights that Austin has now when I was at that same stage in my career? I think Austin needs to be part of part of my retirement plan. We need to figure out how to work with this lady.
Yes, absolutely.
I
Yeah.
I mean,
Great
I
insights.
I wouldn't have these insights if it wasn't for the folks who've led the way, you know, like
Well-
you, Dr. Cook, to get to our society to even where it is today. I know we've got a lot of work to do, but I have phenomenal mentors and leaders that have helped inform me and just help me navigate even my own experience with disability and all of that. So I wouldn't be here without all of you all.
Well, it's
Love
good
the
to
humanity.
know that you are the future. And I hope there's a lot more individuals like yourself who will be carrying on some of the work that we've started. But yeah, it's exciting to hear from you.
Dr. Cook,
Yes.
may I suggest, this has
Yeah.
been a wonderful presentation and discussion. May I suggest we move along to some of
Yes.
the questions, perhaps?
Yes, absolutely. I think we've already discussed how participating in participatory action research is very empowering to individuals and all the benefits they gain from doing that. So yeah, let's move on to the discussions because we're running out of time.
Yeah, this has been a wonderful information and insightful presentation on the principles of participatory action research. We have a few questions to ask. I have two colleagues with me, Dr. Rachel Womack. Dr. Womack, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
I'm happy to, Dr. Bauer. And looking around, I actually think most of the folks on our call today know me, but just in case you don't, I'm Dr. Rachel Womack. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a white woman in my 30s with long, straight brown hair. Today I'm wearing a black long sleeve shirt and glasses, and I am sitting in my office at the Mineral Industries building at the University of Kentucky. I am the Training and LIND Director at the Human Development Institute, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Womack. We also have Bree Alslip with us. Bree, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Of course. My name is Bree Alsip. I am a research assistant with HDI. I am a 24-year-old woman with short-ish brown hair, and my background is a shelf with various decorations on it, and now a cattail in front of me.
Thank you, Bree. We also have Dr. James Kraus has joined us. Dr. Kraus, would you like to briefly introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Jim Kraus. I am an investigator, multi types of outcomes at the Medical University of South Carolina, quadriplegic with a electric wheelchair, and I look like Phil Rumrill's twin, only with a little more hair on my head and on my chin.
Well, you're a lucky man. Yeah. No, I'm just kidding.
Thank you, Dr.
I'm
Kraus.
sorry to hear that.
This first question we have addresses the approach of participatory action research. Participatory action research is an approach to research that argues that those affected by the research should be able to define the nature of the research problem and take the lead in the research design of a study. Do you find it challenging to differentiate your role as a researcher from your disability identity when engaged in the research process? Dr. Cook, would you like to start us off on this one, please?
Maybe we could hear from others who haven't spoken as much as
All right,
first.
sure.
Dr. Kraus, would you like to jump in on that one?
Sure, you're gonna have to restate the question, even though I just looked at it.
I'd be happy to. Do you find it challenging to differentiate your role as a researcher from your disability identity when engaged in the research process?
I don't think personally, because the research I do is with people with some sort of disabling condition. I think it's sort of a natural fit. I do not embellish the fact that I have a disability. I try very hard to steer away from giving like the old wise quadriplegia, I know everything response. So I really separate out the professionalism from the injury itself and from the disability. And the one thing I do think that is difficult for investigators or professionals who have a disability, just much like people in professional positions that are minority, where you get asked sometimes to be the disabled representative on a panel, or like a minority person would get asked to do that, when your qualifications are every bit as strong as the people who don't have that characteristic. And then I think you get pulled in more where there are topic areas where it's simply within your expertise. It is because you've done the research or done the work, and but you're asked to do it a lot because you have a disability, and somebody say, oh, we want a consumer perspective as well. So I do think that that is difficulty, and that needing to separate, well, I appreciate you need someone that's a stakeholder, but I'm here to speak about the science. I take a pretty strong perspective that way of focusing on the science.
Thank you, Dr. Kraus. Would anyone else like to jump in on that question?
Well, Jim, this is Phil. I really appreciate that point, and it makes me think that there can be a fine line between, about taking advantage, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, but taking advantage of opportunities. I'm thinking, Jim, about the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, most of whose grant competitions give points based on the way that people with disabilities are involved in the research process. It's often an advantage if an investigator or co-investigator discloses their disability status. And so being willing to put that out there and understand and take the position sometimes that the personal experience with disability can be a value added credential in addition to other qualifications. And I really do believe that, but there's a fine line between that opportunity and sometimes it's probably just my own internal conception of it, but the fine line between that and tokenism, so somebody's looking for a consultant or an evaluation, an external evaluator on a grant, and they ask you if you want to do that, and you say, okay, here's my resume, sure, I can help you with this, and then you send them the biographical sketch that they put in the application, and they're like, do you mind if we put your disability status in here, too? And we all know that only helps because it's value added in that way. And it's just being strategic, and the purpose of writing a grant is to get it right, no matter what. But sometimes, I don't know, sometimes I do think about that, is it my, is it my resume, or is it these characteristics? And if you tell me it's both, then I'm on board with it. But if you play it too hard that it's just because of my consumer status, that might not be what I want. I might not want to do that. I might want to be involved for both things I bring.
Yeah, and so for grant applications, yes, I do note it. I don't think I embellish it, but it is noteworthy, and it is, it is like anything. If you were having chemical dependency issues, you were someone that had been through it, it is different. You do have a unique perspective that's beneficial. Of course, where there are points with your approach, like with Neidler, different ways to address those points, but I would say that's reasonable. And I don't mean to chastise people for wanting to include disability. I'll just go back to my example with race, where you may have a limited number of Black faculty, for instance, but everybody wants DEI. So the same people, not due to anything that's inappropriate use by others, but they have a legitimate interest. Well, we want to be diverse, but they have a limited pool of people. So the same people will get asked to do committee after committee. And so it creates, in essence, sort of something that's unfair, not because of intention necessarily, can be the best meaning, but it does put you in a difficult position. Now, as you know, I'm an old goat, Phil. I've been around a long time. It's not new, but you know, when I was 35 years old or 40 years old, and I would get asked to do things by people as a, you know, sort of stakeholder consumer representative, and I was upcoming and I had every bit the credentials that those folks did, it was a little insulting, or at least not fair, you know, because it would place the emphasis like, I'm not here because I have a disability. I'm here because I've earned my way here, just like you have. So I remember once, this maybe gets me to think about, I was at a NIDLR meeting, NIDILRR, which is a funding agency. I don't know the audience, but National Institute for Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. They keep expanding the name. That's why it's long to say. Anyway, where they were looking for consumers, but and I was at the SCI Model Systems meeting, and one of the project officers, and she was a little awkward in how she said things at times, but she said, we're not looking for professional consumers. And I said, well, you know, what's a professional consumer? And she said, well, like you or Rory Cooper was in the meeting. Rory Cooper's really well established and out of the University of Pittsburgh, as far as someone that's created novel wheelchair things, for example. And I just said, you know, Margaret, I missed that class of consumers, and it sounded like a wine tester or something. So, you know, there is, you know, there's really a fine line, but it's not like it's easy, never easy being on the outside as trying to be politically correct or whatever. So at the same time, I really don't, you know, throw anybody under the bus if I, you know, even when I guess I could, as long as their intentions are good, and I think they typically are.
This,
Thank
oh,
you.
this
Go ahead, Austin.
I'll add, I have on the opposite end of the spectrum where my disabilities are invisible. And so I sometimes, and where my disabilities are not often thought of by disability, as disabilities. So like OCD, it's a mental health condition. And sometimes I think there's this new wave of like people recognizing that folks with mental health conditions are in fact part of the disability community, or if you have certain chronic health conditions, you are in fact part of the disability community. And so I think sometimes the issue I run into is having to prove that I am in fact, one, disabled, and two, that I am quote, or disabled enough to be that expert on disability. And so I think that is something that I often run into, is on the opposite end of like having to even prove that I am disabled. And that can get kind of frustrating because that disability is this very broad spectrum with lots of diversity within the community. So where is this meter of where you're like, okay, you have enough, you're disabled enough now that you can qualify as an expert on the topic and stuff. So I think that's on the opposite end. That's what I've experienced.
Thank you, Austin, for sharing that. Dr. Cook?
Yeah, my feelings here, Austin. It's very much the same because I have hidden, very stigmatized disabilities. Um, and so it's more an issue of people recognizing that I have disabilities. I'm never asked to be the, token representative because my disabilities are hidden and in some cases I might want to be the representative to add the disability perspective to these committees. But also, I do primarily qualitative research. And so my role as a person with disabilities is definitely can be challenging when I'm doing qualitative research because I have to make sure that when I'm analyzing the results or, beginning to see emerging themes that, oh, these aren't my experiences, these are actually the experiences of the research participants. Whenever I see, so what I have to do then is go back to my colleagues and say, can you tell me what you're seeing? I go back to, for example, we did a study on workplace treatment, how people with disabilities are treated in the workplace. And in my most recent place of employment, I had some really negative experience. My anticipation was, oh yeah, most people are gonna, say that their experiences are negative and that they have received mistreatment. And I was seeing that in the research results, but that was also my experience. So I had to go back to all the transcripts and make sure I wasn't overlooking people's positive experiences. I also had to talk to my research team members and say, what are you seeing? Are you seeing this? Are you seeing something different? Is this just my experience or is this the experience of the research participants? So in that way, having a disability and being a qualitative researcher can be very challenging. But I always, I'm very selective in the research teams I work on so that people will be honest with me and they'll say, no, that I don't see that in the findings. I think that's your exclusive experience, Lynn, or they'll say, yeah, I am seeing that. And I think, Phil, you were on one of that study that we did where only two participants only described positive experiences and the rest described either negative or negative and positive experiences.
Well, I remember that study for that reason and one other, because when you called me and said, we really need a blind person on this study, remember? No, I'm just kidding. You didn't. That was a joke.
Thank all of you for sharing on those responses to that first question. This second question is, one of the purposes of participatory action research is taking action or affecting social change. As a researcher, have you encountered resistance to the approach of participatory action research from researchers who think research should be committed to value neutrality? Who would like to respond to that question?
I'd be happy to stab at it.
All right, Dr. Krause.
I think value neutrality is an interesting term. As a researcher, I think you need to have value neutrality in the sense that you're not looking for anything, whether it be intentional or unintentional. Like Lynn was saying, you don't want your experiences to go and say, I am, I think this is the way it is, and I'm, so you pull out things that are consistent with that. So a long time ago, I had a research assistant that there wasn't much written on women in spinal cord injury, and she was going to analyze some of our data. And when she wrote the introduction, it was everything where women were disadvantaged or had poorer outcomes. And so, some of our own work had shown women to do better in some areas, men to do better in others, as you'd expect. And we see that with race ethnicity as well. And we see it with aging. So, everybody's like, aging, holy cow, everything's going down the crapper here. But some things don't. So you have to be careful that you're not intending to look only at those things that that are consistent with your personal views or whatever. I do think you need to be value neutral in that sense, but I definitely think inclusion of stakeholder groups is, whatever that group is, whether it's with disability or whether it's with people in, low income neighborhoods or whatever that target population, it is important to get that context and input to help you to understand your findings from perhaps a broader perspective than what your own is, or even a perspective beyond the value neutral that somebody can say, what does this mean? And what can we change? Because research, especially social science research, we want it to lead to change. I think we all have one value. We want to see things improve. I've never met it. Say, stuff's too good. We want to see this, not good. So I think it is a separation of your pre-existing expectations, willingness to let the data take you where it goes, and then utilization of people to help you interpret and favorably affect change.
Thank you, Dr. Kraus, for that insightful response. Would any of our panelists like to address that question?
This is Austin. I think Dr. Kraus makes such valuable, important points, but I have a tendency to also want to flip the coin around and be like, well, what happens if the data is showing something of value, but because there's no one with a disability looking at that data, it's a team of non-disabled researchers, they're not going to know, wait, that's actually something valuable and important. And we need to make sure that that information gets shared. So I think it's also the opposite of like, it's important that the disabled researchers have that value neutrality, but also recognizing that we may see value in things that non-disabled researchers wouldn't ever pick up on.
That's
Thank
a
you,
great
Austin.
point.
Go
This
ahead.
is Phil.
Go ahead.
When I think about the 10 most important issues facing the disability community that might be the subject of work that we do, my values are not neutral on any of them. I have very strong points of view about why things are the way they are and how they ought to change, it's so the idea is that the individual, we can't remove our own values from the work that we do, but we do have to be transparent, in our methods. We have to not apply our own biases into the interpretation of findings. And one way to do that is to make sure that the whatever the constituency is fully represented. We've got to have enough humility to be willing to be proven wrong, so we don't go in with a lot of a priori ideas about what might be happening, and we let the results speak for itself. And if we are proven wrong, we have to adjust to that and reconsider the way that we're looking at a particular issue. But the idea of with the research that I want to remove the values from the approach, the reason we come to these particular topic areas, the reason we're doing this in the first place, those are reflections of our values, and I think we have very strong values related to that. It's a matter of, can we be objective about what the findings are? Are people fully included? and to your point, Austin, which is a great one, where they're not fully included, are we looking for ways to make sure that that is happening? And are we convinced that the results we generate through these procedures are as authentic as they can possibly be? Do they really represent the full perspective of the group of people, not our own perspectives, but the perspectives of the population we are studying and partnering with in these projects? So I think these kinds of approaches, and to answer the question, I haven't experienced a lot of pushback, but maybe that's just because in the circles we're in, people who work in this kind of field doing inclusion related work, I think we, you know, as a field, we sort of get that the meaning that people assign to their disability experience and the contributions people with disabilities can make to research and policy change. I think we're already there. You know, we don't have to do a lot of persuading around that. How we do it, the details, I think those are still emerging and can always improve, but we don't usually have to argue too much about mission. You know, PAR among people with disabilities, this isn't a controversial topic. It's one of those things, Lynn, when you were, you know, going through those slides, I think everybody's like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. It's not like, wait a minute, that doesn't make, of course it does. You know, it's sort of, we have the value that it's a good by definition, and I don't feel we have to argue that too much.
Thank you, Dr. Vermeer. Dr. Kraus, it looks like you unmuted. Did you have a follow-up?
Well, I think values are really interesting, and there's such a need for consumer input because, you know, my area is spinal cord injury. And so what do you hear in the media? What is the goal? The goal is to everybody walks, you know, oh, we're going to help walk again. Well, if you ask people with spinal cord injury, and some people have bothered to do it, they talk a lot more about bowel and bladder function. And so the values of the people with cord injury may be quite different than the researchers. And using that ambulation as an example, when you actually do research on ambulation, I'm a strong advocate that you need to, it's qualitatively different to have an ambulatory SCI than a non-ambulatory. The issues are different, not always better. People with our ambulatory, much higher risk of falls, much higher risk of pain, and a lot of people sort of barely hanging on to their ambulation because they're told that it's good, or they're told, or they just feel that if I'm not walking, I'm going backwards. If I can walk, no matter how painful, from point A to point B, and it takes me no matter how long, I'm better than if I'm in a wheelchair where I can do it much quicker. So the value judgments do get in, and certainly do get into the research.
Thank you, Dr. Kraus. Dr. Cook, anything you'd like to add, or otherwise we can move on to the next question? Dr. Cook, I think you are on mute right now.
No, I think we've had a comprehensive discussion of that question, and you can see what a good question it was because of the discussion that it elicited. So I'd say move on to the next slide.
All right.
Question.
Number 3, participatory action research is predicated on the collaboration of scholars and community members to determine together what the needs are to be addressed. Have you seen or experienced conflicts emerge between the researcher and those involved in the collaboration of the research? Who would like to address that question? Start to address that question.
This is Phil. I would say yes, I have. I think I'm thinking of the example of the autistic self-advocacy movement, and thinking about how autistic advocates think about research, particularly intervention research, and how just the interaction with the professionals in healthcare, or those whose intervention approaches might be behavioral in nature. You see a lot of controversy about that. I think it's a very healthy thing, actually. It doesn't always seem healthy when people are engaged in conflict that seems to be sort of irreconcilable, but I think a great it's a great example of the constituency group that is autistic individuals and their families taking ownership and the lead, and being very critical when they feel it's necessary to look at not only the methods, but the research questions and the approaches, and sometimes the very essence of whether a circumstance is indeed a problem, in people's lives. And Lynn, this speaks to the pathologizing bias that we have in a lot of the work that we do. And I think it's just been an interesting case study in terms of how the autistic community has really grabbed a hold of the research agenda. Very, very powerful development that we see, and it's brought with it a lot of need for change in the way we think about the what autism is, whether the condition is something that needs to be intervened upon, and whether we take a strength-based or deficit reduction approach to services, supports, and advocacy for autistic individuals. I guess it's a great example, and it's been really gratifying to see the power of the lobby and the advocacy movement there.
Well said. Caleb says, very well said, Dr. Vermeil. Dr. Kraus, I think you initially unmuted there. Would you like to?
Yes,
follow up?
I would say it's kind of interesting when we talk about utilization of stakeholders and research. Sometimes, I mean, the researchers also have an understanding of what needs to be done, and sometimes it actually can be a difficult partnership with stakeholders, because individuals can have very strong opinions based on their unique circumstances. So again, someone may think, hey, I mean, we've heard with our outcomes research, hey, why don't you work toward finding a device to blah, blah, blah. So there needs to be some collaboration and mutual respect, but it doesn't always go to where researchers just ignore the needs or wants of people within the disability community. Sometimes person or group of people may develop very strong opinions about a common goal to them that may not match the larger goal of the group with disability, and want to guide that agenda maybe more than can be done without the knowledge that the investigator has. And sometimes those things can be, a little simplistic. And I would use the example of one of the major initiatives early on to cure paralysis. This will be done in 5 years, and then 5 more, and 5 more, and 5 more, and 5 more, and 5 more, continues on.
Thank you, Dr. Kraus. Dr. Cook or Austin, anything you'd like to share? If not, we can move on to the next question. I think Dr. Cook, you might be.
Okay. I will be brief, but I do have challenges, again, because I do qualitative research, sometimes with gaining entry into the community I'm going to be working with. And one of these communities was people with multiple chemical sensitivity. And that's such a stigmatized condition. A lot of people don't believe that it's real. And so what I did was I worked with a woman who had, I'll shorten it, MCS, multiple chemical sensitivity. And she was very respected in the community because she was a leader in advocacy efforts. And so she helped me gain entry. She kind of gave me credibility and said, look, you can trust her and you can work with her. She's not going to judge you. And so that was really important to have that gatekeeper to help me to gain entry into that community.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. Austin, any comments, or we can move on to the next question?
We can move on since I know there's lots of great questions and only a little bit of time left.
All right, Dr. Womack has the next question for our panelists.
All right. So actually, in the interest of time, and because I feel that our original question number 4 has been very well addressed, I'm going to let Bree go ahead with question number 5.
Yeah, so the next question asks, for those who have grown up in the wake of the Americans with Disabilities Act, people with disabilities may have more of a disability identity as they enter adulthood than previous generations have had. In contrast, people with disabilities who predated the ADA may not have experienced the influence of the ADA during their formative years. For our panelists, do you see generational differences in terms of disability identity of being out and open in the research setting?
I can take a quick crack at it. I think people had stronger identities before ADA. I really do. My injury was 53 years ago. Used to be more of a strong disabled community, in my opinion. I'm a bit removed from it now. I don't see it in the same way. But in terms of our research, it seemed like people were defining themselves by their cord injury. And I don't mean in a bad way. There seemed to be a brotherhood or sisterhood or whatever terminology you want to use. But, I came along about the time or right after the pioneers, the people were that were that first group, and there weren't any handicap. There was no handicap parking. You had to, if you wanted to get up steps, you had to get up them, but and you did it however. But people seem to have a strong bonding and identity back then, and it seems now that sometimes with our research we have trouble engaging younger people, and right or wrong, it's the feeling that they don't want to be identified as disabled, and all the stuff that, not everything they need, but at least, and ADA's produced a lot of visible things. They're not always function the way it should with teeth in the law where they get enforcement, but it's almost like the view too of people is, they got everything. There's all this stuff out here for things that don't really, where ADA has not met people's needs. And see a lot of places start out with a nice handicap parking up front, and over time turns into, takeout parking and things like that. And so there's just not the enforcement. But I think in terms of identity, I really thought there was a stronger identity where I work with people previously, and I don't sense that as much in newer generations.
Thank you. Go ahead.
It's interesting because as a person with psychiatric disabilities and chronic pain, which are hidden disabilities, I feel my experience has been very different because those disabilities are so stigmatized that, and I started working in the field prior to the ADA that I was not open about having psychiatric disabilities. I was only selectively open until I was promoted to full professor. Then I felt it was safe. And so I did not have a strong connection with the disability community because I feel like people with psychiatric disabilities were not really considered a part of that community. And it wasn't until the, movement affected people with psychiatric disabilities more that I felt comfortable with coming out and having that disability pride. But it took me until, I was in my 40s to really get there. So I think the experience maybe for people with these highly stigmatized and hidden disabilities oftentimes might be different. And I see young people today being very open about talking about their psychiatric disabilities, almost too much. And I worry that they don't get coaching and appropriate disclosure because sometimes the outcomes of their discussions may be really negative. Now, if it's empowering to them and they don't care if the outcomes are negative or not, I say go for it. But I just, just in doing some of the research I've done where I see that people with psychiatric disabilities are still experience a lot of stigma, or perhaps because of my own prior experiences, I have concerns about that and their identity as people with psychiatric disabilities and being maybe too open about it.
This is Austin. Was born in 93, so I am post ADA, but so much of what you share, Dr. Cook, is what I feel internally with my own journey with realizing that I am in fact part of the disability community because I do have a mental health condition and I have a chronic health condition. And it's only been in recent years that I've actually, like, when I do my description and I identify who I am, that I disclose very clearly that I have OCD and chronic migraines, because those are two conditions that aren't like regularly thought about as disability. It's more often those spinal cord injuries or intellectual developmental disabilities, or if you're blind or deaf. And so I think that's part of where I do share, like, hey, I have these conditions, because I want people to recognize, like, we are in fact part of the disability community, because I feel like I really didn't have that when I was in the early years of navigating my own experiences. But I also do feel like, going back to what I said earlier about that, like, fear, or that feeling that I get sometimes from honestly disabled people, that like I'm not disabled enough. So, or their idea that like my conditions aren't disabilities, and so therefore I'm not part of the community. So I think it goes both ways. There's the navigating non-disabled people's views on disability, but also within the own disability community, that because disability is a social construct, and you can ask any one person how they define disability, and it's going to be different for so many different people. So there is that navigating, especially when you have that hidden disability, or you have disabilities that are more stigmatized or may not regularly be viewed as disabilities, and instead it's like, oh, you have this condition that really is an illness and it needs to be cured. And I was like, well, I don't view myself as having a mental illness. I live with my OCD every day. I know it's not going away, and I'm I have pride in that. But it was a journey to get there. So yeah, I echo and share so much of what you experience, even though that I am post ADA.
Thank you, Austin. Dr. Verma, would you like an opportunity to address that question? If not, we can move on.
I'll pass in the interest of time. Just incredible responses. Thanks to my colleagues.
Unfortunately, we have just about run out of time today. I would like to thank all of y'all, our panelists, for taking time out of their day to share their experiences and expertise with us. It has brought richness to the conversation. As advertised, this has been great. It's been an honor and a privilege for all of you to join us today. I would like to say, be well, stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.